hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Indigenous Film. I'm Jean Schumann from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and I will be your virtual host this evening. The Denver Museum of Nature and Science is very pleased to partner with the International Institute for Indigenous Resource Management and the Denver American Indian Commission to present Indigenous Film. As you watch the presentation tonight, please put your questions and comments into the chat. I'll be watching them throughout the event, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. If you are not able to view the film before tonight's event, I will put the link in the chat right now. That should be there. And it's totally fine if you didn't get a chance. This will still be a really interesting discussion. So to begin tonight's event, I would like to introduce Carla Respects Nothing from the Denver American Indian Commission. Carla, whenever you are ready.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Hello, I would like to welcome everyone to tonight's film. My name is Carla Respects Nothing. I am on the Denver City and County American Indian Commission. We would like to thank you and welcome you in an awesome 7 years collaboration with the museum and the Indigenous Film and Arts Festival. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Carla. Next up, I'm Jean Rubin. I direct the Indigenous Film and Arts Festival, which is a program presented by the International Institute for Indigenous Resource Management. With me is Mervyn Tano. He is our Institute president. This monthly film series is a partnership, as you heard, with the Denver Museum of Nature and Science and Denver American Indian Commission. And we extend a huge thank you to the organizations. And I want to acknowledge the folks that you see on screen, but also many, many people behind the scenes that help make the film series possible. So thanks to everybody working on these programs with us. Also want to thank this year's media sponsor, Kuvo Jazz Radio. And a special thank you to Katie Jennings. She is the producer and director of Teachings of the Tree People. And she made it possible for us to have this 3-day screening window for folks to watch on demand. If you have not yet seen the film, the link is still going to be live through noon tomorrow. So you do have a chance to catch up. So I am really thrilled to have Tracy Rector with us tonight. She was the co-producer of the film. I met Tracy in 2005 when she was developing the Native Lens program, a Native youth filmmaking program that was housed at the Skokomish tribe. This was a program designed to empower Native youth using film as a means of self-expression, a way to affirm cultural identity, and for Native youth to have a way to tell their own stories. That program was actually the source of many films that we screened in our festival and became a significant component of our youth film and culture program. Tracy brought some of her kids down twice to the festival so that they could present, at a real festival for some of those kids. It was their first time traveling off the reservation, and the first time actually presenting their films in a theater. And I'll tell you, they were real nervous until the lights came up, and you would have thought that they had been doing this, for years. One of the things that was so impressive to me about the program was the self-confidence that it instilled in these young kids. So Tracy has been a terrific mentor to Indigenous youth and a creative person in her own right. She's made her own films. At present, she is using her filmmaking and creative talents as the managing director of storytelling at a nonprofit called Miatero, based in Washington. So I'm hoping over the course of the hour, we'll be able to touch on all these aspects of Tracy's career. But to start, I'd like to bring Tracy on screen and welcome. And can you kick off our discussion by talking about how you became part of the crew for Teachings and some of the backstory about making the movie and interacting with Bruce and, you know, his role in making the film as well?
Sure, thank you, and thank you everyone, Carla, the museum, all of the people who've taken time out of their evening to show up. I'm grateful to spend time with you this evening. I'm Tracy Rector, and I am currently calling in from Philadelphia, the traditional homelands of the Lenni and Lenape peoples. And I have a little bit of a cold, so sorry if it's hard to understand me, but I'll try to speak up. I was raised in and around the Seattle region, and you know, growing up as a mixed race kid, there weren't many people who looked like me or shared experiences that I had in life. And so I just spent a lot of time in front of the TV, just watching, you know, stories and you know, distinctly felt like there just weren't stories that reflected back to me, you know, my reality, or felt familiar to what our family looked like. Anyhow, jumping ahead, I became a domestic violence counselor for 6 years in my 20s. That work was pretty difficult. You know, it reached a point where I needed to make a decision about, you know, next steps. And I talked to my neighbor who was a herbalist, and she had an apothecary, and I asked if I could go work in her shop. And so I did that for 2 years. I learned about plant medicine. Our resident tarot card reader is Thundercloud, so he just taught me about storytelling, you know, putting pictures together basically, and telling a story, and also just deep listening. That plant medicine work and just, I guess, the spiritual nature of being in that space taught me a lot about the importance of listening and hearing, well, creating an opportunity for people to tell their own stories. And that was what was so special about the domestic violence work, is that when the women came into the shelter, you know, the first thing we did is sat down and heard their story. So I recognized there is something really transformative and important in that relationship and exchange. And talking with Kachi, who owned the plant medicine store, you know, I got to thinking, you know, what was my path? And I decided I wanted to go back to school and learn more about plant medicine. So I decided to enroll at Evergreen State College. And while I was there, that's where I met Bruce Miller and began doing garden work in his garden on the Skokomish Reservation. And about that time, I was really deciding, you know, that I was interested in education, and started interning at Jason Lee Middle School and working with Pacifica Youth, and just recognized that it was important for them to feel as though they were seen and that their culture was engaged as part of like their big education. And so I started thinking about these things and talking to Bruce about, you know, these ideas of what I was seeing, and still working his garden and working in the compost. And about that time, Katie Jennings came to him and asked to do a story together about his life and his work. And he asked if an intern can join them. And I was asked if I'd be interested in being part of the project. And I was like, I don't know anything about filmmaking, but sure. And I'm so glad I said yes. That was 20 years ago now. And that was the very first film project I was ever part of, Teachings of the Tree People.
So when we screened it, the first time we screened it at one of our festivals, you came down to present. And I have to say, one of the reasons I know you're a great storyteller is because I remember stories you told from what, 15, 20 years ago, 15, I guess. And you had some really wonderful stories about Bruce Miller and how he was really very much directing the way the shaping of the film and the progression of the film. Could you just talk a little bit about some of the things that he required in terms of making the cedar mats, like getting kids involved, and just how he was more of a presence in the filmmaking, the making of the film, than just being the subject of the film.
Yeah, Bruce was just so brilliant and so well versed in all the creative arts, and had spent many lifetimes in his one lifetime just learning and observing and doing. And he knew, part of this project that he held the power. And I'm so grateful. It was my first filmmaking experience, that it was a project, I would say shepherded by Katie Jennings, who is just one of the best producers around, an incredible and generous mentor, but also absolutely driven and fostered by or facilitated by, or held by Bruce. He really did drive the energy, and that's just so special and so important. He really set the tone for me in knowing the importance of Indigenous peoples telling their own stories. And everything from, having a shoot set up one day, this fancy crew in, and just, time, what's time? And just learning to slow down and not ask a bunch of questions, but learn. I remember one time, Katie, back then we had tapes, right? So, the camera person popped in the tape, and Katie asked a question. She had a list of, I think, 20 questions. And he spent 4 hours answering the one question. And in doing that, he basically answered all the questions. And he was just so brilliant that way. He just, he knew the pace of a story. He could anticipate what would be asked. He knew what he wanted to get across. And it was just a beautiful teaching that, slow down and make time, and not be completely beholden to this like Western way of doing things, or to, this capitalist clock of time is money, but really authentically build relationships and be a good listener. Vi Hilbert used to say, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so listen.
When I was watching the film for the first time, I kept thinking, oh, we have to get Bruce to come and present the film. And at the end of the film, when you see In Loving Memory, I was so heartbroken. And there are not that many films where after an hour of watching the film, you feel so connected to a person. I mean, it's a tribute to him, and it's a tribute to the filmmakers. But you told me, you consoled me with the fact that he actually had the opportunity to see the final cut. So I think that's nice for the audience to know.
Yeah, one of the teachings of the film he talks about is the living breath. And I feel that too, that, within the film, you experience that presence and that energy and those teachings. And that was at the heart of what the living breath is that as artists, as culture makers, we have that responsibility to be in a good way where we're creating, right? I think many cultures have that same concept when it comes to cooking. You have to have a good heart. You have to be in a good way. Don't cook when you're angry. And he really talked a lot about that our spirit lives on in what we create. And I feel that in the movie, absolutely. A few days before he passed, we did a final screening to get his consent and sign off on the story. And we looked around, his living room was kind of empty, and he had been for the last week starting to give things away. And it was just something we noticed. And he watched the film, and he said it was good. And one thing that stuck with me is he said, now it's up to you to get the story out in the world and share the knowledge that you've learned. And so that's something that has guided me as a filmmaker and as someone who creates spaces for people to learn and to build their own skills is that when we gain the knowledge, it's so important to share and share forward. We were all gathered at the Seattle Art Museum and he was supposed to come present. And that's when we found out that he had crossed over. And there was something about all being together and hearing that at the same time. And just, yeah, what a meaningful presence he was in so many lives and still is, right? Mm-hmm. His living breath has carried forward, yeah, this family, this network, this encouragement to share the knowledge.
So, the film raises, all kinds of sort of tangential issues, and I know Mervyn wanted to talk a little bit about foraging.
Yeah, there's a couple of points that perhaps are not really explicitly laid out, but that are really kind of embedded throughout the film, which is one of the reasons I like the film. It's not a polemic. It's a story about Bruce Miller. Okay, one of the things that is kind of a part of this idea of Native peoples, indigenous peoples, whether they be American Indian, Samoan, Maori, or Kanaka Maoli, is their connection with these plants, with these foods. And there is I think a tendency among folks to look at, for example, the gathering of medicines, of berries, of nuts, etc., as some sort of happenstance kind of a thing. I mean, it is opportunistic. Down in California, you got these oaks in there. Isn't it great that God, in His infinite wisdom, provided these those oak trees for us to gather acorns, and not really understanding that those are there as a result of not only the largesse of the Creator, but also the hard work of families who were stewards, who Malama took care of these places, and so very often you get the sense as you read about foraging. You read books and articles about foraging, how to go into the wild and scoop up a whole bunch of stuff and live off the land. One of the things I think that Bruce is talking about is an ethical way of doing it in a good way. Can you kind of describe some of the experiences you've had where there has been that kind of conflict in worldviews about the bounties of nature and our rights to it and all of that kind of stuff?
Sure. I mean, yeah, the work I do right now is very much about Indigenous guardianship, stewardship of resources, Indigenous rights. And not many people, or maybe more people, know now that 80% of the remaining biodiversity on Earth is on Indigenous land. And that says so much about being in balance, about the reciprocal nature of being in balance with the way we live, right? It's, when you talk about foraging or hunting or gathering medicine, there's a relationship that's been established by many people for tens of thousands of years to place. There's not a separation to land, to the water, to the air, to all beings. And so I think it's pretty special. I mean, it's pretty much a statistic that, kind of wakes people up, but also we shouldn't just be woken up by this kind of linear science. We should start opening our eyes that it's important not to take more than what you need. And I think we inherently understand this as human beings, right? But there's so many Indigenous peoples who are generously sharing, this knowledge and these teachings too about, look around you, notice, pay attention if a plant's healthy or not, pay attention if a plant's been over harvested. And those are some of the things he talked about, in the film, and he would talk about on walks, is not only understanding the benefits of the plants, but understand the benefits of them being in relationship to one another and paying attention to their needs too as plant people. And that's part of, being in a healthy way, in a good, responsible relationship, noticing those needs.
That concept of reciprocity doesn't always factor into, the newcomers to this concept of foraging, right? You just take all this great
Scoop
stuff,
it all up,
scoop it
right,
up,
right.
But there's a responsibility back to the plants and the animals, right? You give and you take. So there's kind of a related issue, and that's the some of these products become real popular. I'm thinking of things like quinoa all of a sudden became, the health food, wonder. And taro all of a sudden in Hawaii got to be a popular food. And a lot of times these things are driven by folks are looking at the healthy aspects of food, not necessarily the cultural aspects of food. And so one of the things you get this commercial production, and then it's not necessarily in the same place, right? If you can get the seeds, and you have the right climate, you can grow these things. And then you start to lose the diversity within that type of plant, because people are looking for what's most suited to commercial production. So can you talk a little bit about some of your experiences with that kind of situation?
Yeah, one of the lessons Bruce shared was the importance of diversity. And, in order to be healthy, we need all sorts of diversity of people, diversity of plants, diversity within our forests, within all the ecosystems. And when we start preferencing, one type of plant or one strain or one species over another, we start kind of diminishing that diversity, and we start straining out the holistic benefits a plant can offer. So that's always an important realization that I carry with me too. And, and that's part of the popularity of, say, like heirloom tomatoes. People are realizing that it's important not to have these monocultural crops, and the impacts on the soil, the impacts for future generations if we're only growing one type of strain or vegetable, etc. We also see this with medicines, right? Like with white sage, and it's been so popular to smudge, and non-native peoples, non-indigenous peoples, are just, in this kind of new age wave of thinking that that's an important connection to spirit. And what we're seeing is a huge depletion of the sacred medicine that really is supposed to be, meant for those people and places where it grows, and specifically indigenous peoples. And so once we start commodifying these things, that's where we get into trouble, because then there's mass consumption too. It's not moderation. Of course, these are my personal opinions, but I feel like these are ways of thinking that people are trying to encourage us to all talk about these days. Everything in moderation, be aware of not stripping an environment of sacred medicines, and that people need those, and people who've been there since time immemorial need those. And also just what's the nature of our reality these days, and commercialism and capitalism, and what's this crazy train we're on, right? It's just kind of getting out of control, and it's unsustainable. And so we see that, you know, take shape in places like the variety of foods or lack thereof, and the health of the earth and the impacts.
I have I do a lot of reading. I've done a lot of reading about wine, wine growing and wine making. I don't drink wine, but I found the notion of terroir, this idea that a wine, a grape, would take from the amount of sun, the soil, the nutrients in the land, the way it was taken care of, would all have an effect on the taste of the product. And maybe 20 years ago, we had a roundtable on the role of traditional healers in protecting biodiversity. And we had a traditional healer from Malawi. And he was telling us how a healer had to be really knowledgeable about the plant, not just the plant, but where the plant was, and at what part of the year it was more powerful. That at some point you would get the plant from this side of the mountain, and perhaps the next time at the down the bottom of the hill. And it came to me, I had never connected the notion of terroir with traditional knowledge, with the knowledge of plants in the kind of traditional medicine. I said, oh my God, that's why I've been studying this. This is why I've been learning about it. It's not about the wine, it's about this stuff here. So it was a real revelation. There's a tendency to think a plant is a plant, an herb is an herb, and is an herb. But folks who know what they're doing understand that there are significant differences, sometimes subtle differences, depending on terroir.
Yeah, I think about some plant medicine traditions, some teachers say that you can really only get to know 5 plants in a lifetime, because it takes that long to know in and out. And it's these things that you talk about. It's where does a plant grow? At what time of year is it harvested? What nourished that plant? What was the water like? What was the sun like? What were the elements around that plant? And it's not just as easy as, picking a piece of lavender and saying, oh, this is good for,
Right.
This will relax you. It's not that simple. There's so much more. And I was thinking about, these teachings. One time I was out in Squim, and they have all these lavender farms. I'll just stick with lavender because I spoke up about it. But on this lavender farm, they played classical music for the bees, because they recognized that the bees were much happier when they heard Chopin. And that the lavender smelled sweeter. It was more potent when the bees were happier. And so it's just like, oh my God, that's amazing, you know? And when you think about plant medicine and the care for the earth and recognizing that, you know, all beings carry emotions, whether it's a cedar tree, whether it's, you know, uh, a lavender plant, whether it's a bee, but all of this contributes to the power of the medicine within.
Yeah,
That we are part of a system. We're not separate from a system.
yes.
And that's one of the teachings Bruce shared as well.
So I want to remind folks that they can type questions into the chat. You know, Mervyn and I can talk all night with Tracy, and we have at times.
Yeah, right.
So, but, you know, folks have questions, feel free to type them in. One of my favorite segments of the film is when Bruce is chopping up the cedar in the blender.
Yeah.
And what I love, because he says something to the effect of, you know, we've always adopted better technology if there's better technology. And I like it because there are people who have these notions of what makes something authentic. And a lot of times there's this focus on, well, what tool did you use? And, you know, if you didn't carve something with, you know, with stone, it wasn't authentic, you know. And there's this focus on how was it made, and the idea that somehow time stops for Indigenous people. You know, time stops a century ago, and if you're using a technique that's different, that's no longer authentic. And I just love that he says, you know, you adopt a technology that makes life easier, and this blender is great.
Right.
Yeah, culture is not static, it's dynamic, right? And I strongly feel and truly believe Indigenous peoples are some of the most brilliant technologists around and have adapted for tens of thousands of years, many times over, and have found new ways to create and to do and to be. And that was such an awesome example. Yeah.
Can you tell folks a little bit about your work at tell people a little bit about Neotero and what you're doing there? Because I think, you know, we tend to think about filmmakers making film through production companies, and there's a lot of other places where storytelling and filmmaking certainly has a home. And Tracy just put up the website, and she's probably too polite to say this, so I will say it. It's a nonprofit, and they would love to have your donations. So
yeah, no, thanks for asking me about Neotero. It's, you know, it's been pretty special. Again, I came to this work through just kind of humbly being interested in compost, right? And just loving the idea of how do you create a soil community that will grow good food to nourish people. And I've always just kind of found my peace, you know, being in the natural world, and to come into filmmaking and not knowing this would be my path for 20 years at least. It's been just such an honor to combine, you know, just storytelling, Indigenous rights, BIPOC community, storytelling, and the environment. The environment has always been present in everything I do. And today, I'm now the managing director of storytelling at Neotero, and all of our work is to be in service to and support Indigenous peoples, and specifically in their Indigenous guardianship. So I feel like I'm kind of living the dream, and Bruce opened the door to that, you know. I don't know if I would have been on this path if it wasn't for him. Yeah, I get to work with Indigenous peoples around the world, in Africa and Asia, Sapni territory, in the Pacific and Amazonia, and create spaces and ways and tools for them to share their stories out in the world. And it's all stories about their territory, their language, their culture, and lessons that we can all learn from too. So it's all pretty awesome. I get to do filmmaking and I get to still be connected to the earth every day in the ways that I think.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Was there a difference between, all the change in Mother Earth and the way people thought of how she was before COVID and after? Because I know, like on some reservations, they really never thought of gardening, just the simple stuff. And, we grew up, learning how to go pick those and learning when we were kids to do that. And then, we would come to the urban city and setting. And, it's like, wow, people don't even remember how to grow stuff. That was during the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. That's so true. It seems like a lot of people started growing foods again and being interested in that and cooking again too. And just, yeah, realizing how good food and good cooking brings family together and people around the table. Um, one example we saw is in Hawaii, without the tourists, our we have two staff members on the ground. We have a bunch of filmmakers and creative people that we work with there too, and they were all like, "Oh my gosh, the fish are coming back. We could grow taro." It just all of this excitement around it feeling calmer, it being cleaner, and having time to connect, and then the healing that brought to community. I'm really glad you asked that question.
Yeah, and same for the environment. They said it cleaned up when there was no more traffic.
So amazing.
Yeah. Thanks.
I see Katie Jennings is here.
Right, she is. Let's see, is this a question?
Oh, looks like she might be heading out. Well, it's good that you're here, Katie. I forever appreciate you.
So I'll just share her thought with the rest of the folks. Just say, so Katie Jennings, the film director. So nice to see you, Tracy. Thank you for connecting people with the film and Bruce's teachings. I can't stay for the rest of the evening, but what a great presentation. Thank you, Jean, for making the space for the discussion and getting the word out there. So, the whole reason for having our Indigenous Film and Arts Festival and this Indigenous film series is, I guess one of the reasons really is to provide a venue for Native storytelling, because they're wonderful stories and they really do need to get out there. And it's relevant, it's 17 years since we made the movie, and it's still an impactful and meaningful message. So I don't know if Katie's already signed off, but really great that she could join us for part of the program.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? When those doors open in our lives and just kind of what spirit intends for us. And we may or may not always know what the next step is, but how important it is to take those leaps of faith and to just trust the process. And I distinctly remember, in that moment, okay, I'm going to do this. And my life was forever changed. And I'm so grateful for that.
I have a kind of a question within a comment. And it's about the role of people like Bruce Miller. Okay, they're different. They have a vision, and they're driven. And you see that with folks who are looking all over the country for heirloom apples. they're looking at abandoned farms, looking for abandoned orchards, trying to find all of these different varieties. And it's the same way with the folks who are looking at different kinds of varieties of cows. Because you raised a point earlier, this notion of the commodification, this kind of monocropping is really devastating to diversity. Now, given the kind of proclivities of industrial agriculture, all of these kinds of varieties we'll start losing them, except for people like Bruce Miller. So can you talk a little bit about how the kinds of things you've seen in food, in medicines, where in a sense it takes almost a crazy person to pursue that kind of vision.
Well, that's not the first time I've been called crazy. It feels like I'm in good company. Real quick before answering that, it looks like Colleen Jolie is here, who's a very special person who lives in the region. And she helped to start the Basket Weavers Association with Bruce. So I just wanted to shout out that I saw your message, Colleen, and it's so great that you're sharing time with us here tonight. Yeah, it's interesting. We're all connected, right? In the ways that we take in food, that we're connected to food, that we grow and support and honor, are ways that we share and connect through, a meal. Those are some of the, Carla raised, some of the, I guess, lessons that came from the pandemic. And those are some of the conversations that I've been in with people, just paying attention to our impacts, right, on the environment. And then inevitably that comes into our food and what we take into our bodies, and paying attention to how that feels. And something that I've been doing personally, for example, is going to more farmers markets to try to eat locally and more kind of farm to table. And that feels like a privilege, but it also feels important. Luckily in our area, we have a number of Indigenous and BIPOC farmers. And so that's something I've really grown to appreciate, is to look for that, and to support those people who are taking time to be on the land, work the land, and to nurture us and to feed us. And I hope to see more people decide to take those steps. I've even actually talked with young people who are beginning to create intentional communities, who are buying land together and creating shared spaces to grow food, to live. And I think this is a sign of our times. People realize the importance of family and community. People realized how scary it is to be alone. People realize that we're in a climate crisis and we need one another to survive.
Yes, yes.
So we have a question here from Pilar. Can you elaborate on the principle that you don't teach everything to one person, but teaching different things to different people, because that way we need each other. We have a web of connection that way.
Yeah, that was one of the teachings Bruce shared out, is that when you teach information to different people, then you need one another. It's like that on a film crew. You could have a director, a producer, a cinematographer, sound person, maybe even a makeup artist. And when everybody has the way they contribute to the bigger picture, you all need each other to create that picture. It's not necessarily a hierarchy or about, one person matters the most over another. We when we realize that each and every one of us is special in our own ways, and if you happen to be a person who's in a position of sharing knowledge, leading, teaching, whatever that may be, that it's important to foster that interconnectivity with those around you. And so that was something interesting to observe. So he might work with one person, in spirit, might work with one person in gardening, might work with one person, in terms of harvesting. And so then when it was time for people to take up the space that he left, sorry, my eyes are starting to bother me a little bit. Everybody needed to work together and come together. And that's beautiful. That's part of that diversity, the diversity in every ecosystem, realizing that we all can learn a lot for working together and honoring each other's gifts.
He also, he talks about the intergenerational connection. And I like when he talks about having the kids involved with making the cedar mats, because when they're done, they come with their parents to see them, and they'll bring their kids and they'll bring their grandkids. And so they become forever connected to what they did and where they did it.
Isn't that beautiful? And you protect what you love, right? You have that experience of learning from cedar, maybe, and you share that, maybe that will inspire someone to be an environmental defender, one day. And those intergenerational connections are key, I feel, in sharing that knowledge and that love and that inspiration.
Which actually, in part, you answered in part the next question. How can that principle be part of our solutions to the climate and ecological crises?
Yeah, I think a lot about this in the work that we do at Taro, because we support, collective territory, collective communities, and realizing that I think one of the results of capitalism is individualization or individualism. And it's just critical now more than ever that we realize everything we do, everything we say, the way we carry ourselves, the way we treat one another has an impact, has reverberations. And that's all connected to the climate crisis. It's we're all in this together, and we really need one another to survive into the future. It's not about being individuals at this point. We all have an impact. Some more than others, like corporations, need to be held accountable, and the billionaires who are hoarding. But honestly, there's power in numbers, and if we could recognize that we can leverage our collective strengths and intentionality, we might just have a chance.
One of the most poignant moments in the film for me is when somebody asks Bruce, "Why didn't you teach us?"
Yeah.
And he says, "Why didn't you come to learn?"
Yeah, is that beautiful?
And I think, there's a lesson there that, we can't take our elders for granted. And, it's one thing to theoretically appreciate the knowledge, but if they're going to pass the knowledge to the next generation, that next generation has to step up and say, I'm ready, I'm here to learn.
We were, as I said a little bit earlier, we were just on Fiji and community and talking with folks. And we were in this one area. There's only 2 elders left who are in their 80s. And we were being asked as storytellers, oh my gosh, we're ready. We recognize that these 2 are treasures. They're the last to have lived a certain type of way in life where you understand the birds, where you're intimately connected with all the workings of the environment, where you understand the old language, the old ones. And they really are ready to make space for these elders to tell their stories. And there's a recognition, what's so beautiful, there's a recognition by young people that, oh, we need to make sure that we've recorded these stories because there's so much to learn and so little time left. And their knowledge may just, be what saves us. And so it's interesting, the urgency right now. And I hear you. It's so important to take great care and to spend time with our elders.
Yeah, I think Colleen is offering you some remedy.
Oh, thank you, Colleen.
Send her your address.
I would love to come visit sometime soon. It's been a long time.
Okay, here's a question here. It says, Bruce Miller spending time in Vietnam seems to go against everything he stood for and taught. Did he ever mention how he reconciled those 2 parts of himself?
I can't speak for him in any way, but my observations were, he was a person of the times, and there was a draft, and there was an expectation, and there was just a different sensibility. And for many communities of color, especially Native peoples, serving and being a warrior is just part of the fabric of life too. So I think, as humans, and again, this is all my own opinion, but I think as humans, we're complicated and nuanced and go through many phases as we age, right? And as the world around us changes too, we're reflections of what the ethos is and what society is. So he had that experience, and it was an experience that informed him. And he felt that it was important to share that with us as part of the film.
So we're coming up to the end of our time. Folks have sort of last call for questions here. Folks have a burning question they haven't had a chance to ask. But
yeah, it's just been so nice to be in conversation. One thing I want to say is that, you too have been doing this work for a long time and creating space for these stories to be heard. And I really feel that that's part of the healing that we all need is, access to experiencing these ways, these stories, to share time, to be in conversation, to laugh, to cry, all those things, and you've both opened up so many doors for me. I think of just one example is like Andrew McLean, Okpia. And I first saw, one of his films at your festival, and since then he was able to mentor as part of our program. And there's just so many ways that you both have opened doors for a lot of people. And so I just also want to take a moment before we wrap to say thank you for that. And thank you for being long timers and doing this for so long.
Yeah. That's nice to hear. Thank you. Anything we're getting some thank yous in the comments. Great film, and thank you. Thanking you for the film, thanking you for the discussion. So thank you from us. Really thrilled you could be here.
Yeah.
And
Take care of yourself.
yeah,
Thank you.
happily it was set up to be a virtual program, so you didn't have to come all the way to Denver.
Well, it's still getting out of a sick bay.
That's true. That's true. Thank you for being a trooper. And
Yes, thank you.
thank you, as always, thanks to the museum for hosting us, and thanks to the commission for being such a great partner as well. And of course, thanks to the audience. You know, without you, it would just be a private chat.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Tracy, thank you so much. Please go lay down. My goodness, everybody is like, please feel better. And thank you so much, Jean and Merv. I really appreciate it. Thank you. As always, wonderful discussion. And again, thank you to the audience. If you enjoyed tonight's program and would like to support the Indigenous Film Series, I will put a link into the chat right now. Oh, and I also want to make sure I put a link into the chat for the film. If you haven't had a chance to watch it after this discussion, I imagine it would be really, really great to go watch that film now. I loved it. I'm also going to throw in a link to the virtual donation bucket. We really appreciate, if you can, helping to make these films accessible to everyone. And that, unless there is anything else that we would like to cover tonight, that ends our virtual session here.
So can you pop in the Neotero website as well, because they have a donation link on their page too.
Absolutely. I will do that right now. All right, that is in the chat. I will put those links in there a couple times. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Good night.